buonasera, ben arrivati. My name is Renata Sperandio. I'm the director of the Italian Cultural Institute. I'm among the few people who are in Dublin now for this meeting. It is one of the few advantages of this Zoom situation whereby we meet people from all over the world, and tonight is one of those occasions, and I would like to thank Enrica Maria Ferrara for having edited the book that brought so many people together. So tonight we will start with Michael Cronin. Thank you, Michael, for being part of this event, Chair of French at Trinity College Dublin, but where he is also the director of the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation. Michael has been protagonist of many events with the Italian Cultural Institute. I can remember the Dante Summer School and several other occasions where we were so happy to have him here in Fitzwilliam Square. He will talk, he will give us an introduction to tonight's topic, which is the book that Enrica Maria Ferrara has edited. Enrica, who's a friend for many of us, is teaching fellow in Italian at Trinity College Dublin. She has also been part of our institute, having created so many situations whereby people got in love with Italian literature. Her interests are in various, but in particular Italo Calvino, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Elena Ferrante, and of course, many of these interests are present in her publications. I would like to mention that tonight's event will be recorded, so be aware of that. And also, one particular, characteristic of tonight's event is that we would like to conclude with a reading by Tiziano Scarpa, who will join us later. We are still not totally sure he will make it. It will be a bit of a surprise, and it will be in about an hour time. He had other engagements before this event, so he promised he would join us at about 8 o'clock Irish time. So thank you very much. It's lovely to have so many people and to see so many faces and to meet again so many friends. And I'll leave it to Michael for the introduction. So, before I go ahead, there is I'm sure you're all familiar with the Zoom event. There is a chat that you can use to ask questions, and either Enrica or myself will take good notes of your questions. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening. So,
okay, yeah, I don't know if everybody can hear me. I'd like to thank the director of the Institute for a very kind introduction, and to thank especially Enrica Maria Ferrara for having asked me to launch this book this evening. The French theorist, anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss was asked in the mid-1960s by UNESCO if he'd write a short paper on the contribution of social science to humanism in the technical age. And he made a distinction between three types of humanism. He firstly distinguished what he called aristocratic humanism, which is basically the humanism of the Renaissance, where the main preoccupation was with the classical texts of antiquity. Then he defined what he called bourgeois humanism, which was what he called the humanism of exoticism, which involved mainly a concern with the Middle and Far East. And finally said in the 20th century, there was the era of what he called democratic humanism, the central discipline of which he saw, of course, as anthropology, which would cover all of human cultures. Now, a lot of people, of course, have cast aspersions and doubts on the democratic nature of that humanism that he describes. But what I want to stick with for a moment is the first of those three humanisms that are defined by Claude Lévi-Strauss. This notion of what he calls aristocratic humanism from the Renaissance period. Because one could argue that the kind of central figure in that period was not so much the painter that we often associate with the Renaissance period, but the philologist, the person who, in the mind and in others, was concerned with producing reliable, useful texts from classical antiquity. So when we think of the names of the period, people like Poggio Bracciolini, Leonardo Bruni, Pierpaolo Ruggiero, Cencio Rusticci, Bartolomeo Ragazzi de Montepulciano. All of these philologists, if you like, were people who were primarily concerned with the notion of trying to establish some kind of text and language to describe texts that would create a sensation of trust, reliability, and so on. And this has led the Lebanese theorist of the digital, based in Canada, Milad Douay, to talk about what he calls the impératif philologique, the philological imperative. And what he means by this is the requirement of thinkers, of theorists in the contemporary age to investigate changing fields of meaning, investigating how our understandings of key words, key terms, the notion of the human, the notion of the machine, the notion of the animal, how these are constantly changing, what the fields of reference are, and to have a kind of contextual and historical understanding that will allow us to come up with a kind of measured assessment of what is happening in the contemporary moment. And I think all of the essays in this collection are a testament to a kind of philological imperative, the one that's described by Douay, not in the sense of a kind of conservative curatorial conservation of fixed or stable meanings, but rather a kind of subtle, exciting and innovative exploration of how key terms and concepts are changing in the contemporary moment, which is often described more generally as the post-human moment. Because it seems to me that there is a kind of intellectual, historical and conceptual justice or rightness about the fact that if it is very much Italian thinkers and writers who are to the fore in conceptualizing, in defining, articulating and expressing humanism in the Renaissance period, it should also be Italian scholars or scholars writing on Italian literature, culture and cinema who will have important things to say to us about post-humanism. And I think that Enrica Maria Ferrara is very correct, is right in her statement in the illuminating opening chapter of this book when she talks about Italy as a kind of nest, a kind of crucible for post-humanist culture. Of course, I'm very conscious of the fact that what I'm doing tonight is I'm launching one book, but I could in fact be launching 13 books, because each one of the chapters in this book has a kind of intellectual richness, conceptual complexity, and kind of textual seductiveness that would merit each of them its own launch. But I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm limited by time. So what I'm going to try and do is to try and suggest the ways in which this book is picking up on what seemed to me to be crucial concerns of the contemporary moment. One of the texts that greatly preoccupied and concerned those philologists in the 15th century was Ovid's Metamorphoses. And one of the stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses that was often repeated and taken up in various versions was the story of Daphne, who is pursued by the god Phoebus Apollo. She, of course, has been the recipient of an arrow which extinguishes rather than ignites desire, and she is desperate to escape the ministrations, the advances of the god. And here we get the intervention of her father, the river god, who turns her into a laurel tree. The French philosopher Catherine Malabou, who took part in a seminar in the university last week, uses the story of Daphne in her 2009 book, Ontology of the Accident, to think about what happens in moments of catastrophic change or catastrophic shift. In other words, what she says characterizes Daphne. What happens to this Greek dryad is the absolute necessity to escape, but at the same time, the seeming impossibility of escape. And the only way in which you can escape in this moment is the escape of form. Daphne literally changes form. She changes into a laurel tree. One of the things that, so this is what Malabou argues is something that is the kind of the ontological consequence of the accident, that when a catastrophic accident occurs, with the necessity of escape, the impossibility of escape, what humans seek then is to change form, is in order to deal with this difficult situation. Well, we could say that what we're living through at present, COVID-19, is a beautiful illustration, if you like, of the ontology of the accident. Because when we think about it, we don't know whether the origins of the present pandemic were the accidental manipulation of a sample in the laboratory, or the accidental transmission, the accidental zoonotic transmission of a disease from an animal to a human. But what we do know is, whatever the origin of that accident may be, that the lives of people all over the planet have been changed in very, very dramatic ways. When Catherine Malabou draws up the kind of list of people who are affected by changes in their life that are kind of accidental, that happen all of a sudden and then precipitate these terrible consequences, she talks about people become unemployed all of a sudden, people become homeless all of a sudden, people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of a catastrophic event, or people where an accident leads to acute or profound depression. And she also lists the people who are victims of natural disasters. And of course, we can see the pandemic as one of these. And what she says then is that these people suddenly become strangers to themselves because they could not escape. It was not, or not only because they were broken or overwhelmed by grief or misfortune, they had become different people, reborn, belonging to a different species. So one could say that one of the effects of COVID-19, of the repeated lockdowns, of the lockdown that we're living through, once again, all of us who are looking at this this evening on this screen, is we find ourselves in a situation where we feel the need to escape. We're faced with the impossibility of escape. So what do we do then? Does that mean that we're obliged to think about what the forms of escape might be? Do we need to come up with new forms that will help us to think about this predicament? But of course, what makes this predicament even more pressing, and what makes the contents of this volume even more important, is that, of course, what the pandemic is a kind of metonym, is a kind of a subset of a much larger lockdown, which is the fact that as a result of the climate emergency, we are locked into the consequences of systems and forms of development, which mean that the very future of the species on the planet is endangered and imperiled. For the first time, if you like, in our history, we have a situation where a particular life form has the potential, and in fact is in the proceeds of enacting the destruction of the conditions of the life of that form itself. What, if you like, is the consequence of that? Well, one of the consequences is that, rather like the pandemic, we find ourselves in a situation where there is the need to escape. We need to escape the consequences of this ecological crisis, of this ecological emergency. Increasingly, we feel the sense of the impossibility of escaping from the consequences of this crisis. And we then, if you like, are faced with the situation or the question, what do we do? Now, what the richest people on the planet, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, have decided to do is to escape. They don't believe that it's impossible to escape. They're investing in Martian colonization, interplanetary travel as a way of escaping the consequences of the ecological meltdown. But this, of course, possibility, this kind of fantasy of the limitless frontier is one, of course, that is not available to the vast majority of us who live on our planet and those who will come after us. So what, if you like, has occurred as a result of the pandemic and the larger, if you like, ecological crisis that it's feeding out of, is a sense of the vulnerability of humans as a species, a vulnerability they share with other living species, but also, of course, the crisis in anthropocentrism, the crisis in human supremacy, is graphically illustrated both by the pandemic and the ecological emergency. So what that means then is that it is urgent for humans to think about two questions. One is, what are the kinds of forms that we will come up with that will make living in this new situation, this new context, livable? And secondly, how do we, in terms of this new vulnerability, develop what Rosie Berdotti, who's referenced in many different chapters in this book, how do we develop what she calls transversal subjectivity? And what she defines transversal subjectivity is, she talks about a transversal entity encompassing the human, our genetic neighbors, the animals, and the earth as a whole. In other words, how do we develop a sense of relatedness to the organic and the inorganic entities with whom we share this planet, both now and into the future? Because to some extent, what's Daphne doing when she is she is transformed into a laurel tree, as she is at some level experimenting a kind of transversal, a radical form of transversal subjectivity, where she's passing into another form, into the form of a tree. And of course, she's doing this with the help of Peneus, the river god. Both of these large questions, loads of these large predicaments, which are absolutely central to our current moment, are precisely the questions that are explored in this collection of essays. One of the most notable dimensions to the book is the way in which, in the chapters 2 and 3, so Gianna Conrad's chapter on Leopardi's Zibaldone, and Alberto Goggioli's, Monica Jansen's, and Carmen Vandenberg's essay on Pirandello, is the way in which they explore precisely this question of transversal subjectivity by showing, if you like, that the notion of a kind of a post-humanist question, a post-humanist predicament, is something that illuminates earlier periods, early writings in Italian literature, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, shows the contemporary relevance of those Italian writers and their writings, the writings of Leopardi, the writings of Pirandello, to the contemporary moment, to how we might think about the notion of interspecies relationality, interspecies communication in this contemporary moment, where we have to radically rethink what it is to be human on our planet in our time. Marco Amici, in looking at the speculative fiction of Laura Pugno, Enrica Maria Ferrara in her exploration of the Neapolitan novels of Elena Ferrante, and Giancarlo Alfano's look at contemporary Italian poetry, are asking very, very important questions about the body, about how the body negotiates, lives with, survives, is modified by the interface with the machine, with the bodies of other humans, with the bodies of other animals, how we live, if you like, in a society where there's an extraordinary kind of multiplication of images of the body, but the sense of bodily integrity, the notion of corporeal boundaries, seems more uncertain, seems more fluid, seems more flexible than ever. So it's not just a question, if you like, of how the body is defined or situated under the kind of the headings or the criteria of race, gender, or social class, but how the body kind of negotiates a sense of itself in dealing with the notion, in kind of Deleuzean terms, of becoming machine and becoming animal. One of the consequences of the lockdown is that we have developed a greater sense than ever before of the kind of cyborg dimensions to our personalities, the way in which we've become contiguous with, we've kind of melded with the machines that we use, is that we're not allowed to touch other people, but we're endlessly touching the screens of the IT devices that surround and crowd our lives at present. And some very interesting chapters. Cristina Varade's chapter on Aldo Nove and Andrea Di Carlo, Leonora Lima's chapter on Luciano Bianciardi and Tiziano Scarpa, I hope we'll be able to listen to later on this evening, and Annalisa Soma and Serena Tedesco's chapter on Ariel Martin and Viola Di Gradio. All of these chapters explore whether it's the mobile phone, whether it's the white good of the washing machine, whether it's the notion of care as expressed through technical devices. But they all explore how profoundly tools have, if you like, altered the way in which we inhabit the world, that our communication devices, which often become symbols not so much of communication as symbols of non-communication, the way in which the goods themselves, white goods, washing machines, become something that's both the symbol of particular kinds of socioeconomic progress in society, but also become extraordinarily kind of overdetermined symbols of changing gender roles in domestic settings, but also, if you like, things that are more than simply kind of metaphors for human intimacy, but also goods or devices that actually go into the what seems to be the inviolable inner sanctum of human intimacy and remake them in often dramatically different ways. In terms of the how these different chapters negotiate or think about the limits to what it is to be human, what where those limits lie in terms of the human, the animal, the machine. Essays by Eugenio Bolengaro, Enrico Vettore's essay on the writings of Gianni Celati, Bolengaro's writing about Aldo Nove, and Fabio Camilletti's article, chapter on zombies. All of these chapters are exploring how can we actually think about transcending anthropocentrism? In other words, how do we stop the post-human from simply becoming the superhuman, extending, if you like, the remit of anthropos to now take over the realm of the machine, to take over the realm, to kind of replicate older forms of human supremacy. So what Vettori, in looking at different philosophies from different parts of the planet, for example, the notion of Zen Buddhism, Camilletti to the notion of living dead, the human, the zombies, the living dead, and Bolengaro looking at Nove's kind of pushing of his writing perception to the limits. All of these, if you like, are trying to explore precisely the emergence of new forms, precisely what these kind of forms, these kind of formes de fuite, these forms of escape that Malibu talks about, might look like as they are aesthetically or artistically expressed, whether on the screen, in the comic book, in the form of music, or in the form of novelistic writing. And Paolo Saporito, in looking at Antonini's films, Le Chisse, L'Avventura and La Notte, looks at how cinema, the kind of materiality of cinema, the materiality of the camera, can suggest to us different ways of looking at the relationship between humans and objects. If in a kind of the conventional, traditional, earlier view, kind of Cartesian view of the world, you had the world full of objects, kind of inert matter that could be kind of manipulated willy-nilly by the supreme, all-powerful, omniscient human subject, with the human as the active agent and matter as the passive. What we see in the contemporary moment is the revenge of objects. The objects out there, the kind of hyper objects that Timothy Morton has described, extended in time and space, like climate change, the elements of the inorganic and the organic are coming back to bite us hard. So one of the things that Bennett talks about, Karen Bennett, is the notion of a kind of vital materialism, that the object world comes alive, assumes its own agency. And what Saporito explores in Antonioni's films is what thinking about that new kind of agency, investing the object world with that kind of vital materialism might indeed look like. Of course, what all of the essays in this absorbing collection are dealing with is that fundamental paradox of how do we, with words, try and think about the more than human, about worlds that are beyond words. How do we, in essays written in language in a book, deal with the problems of the hubris of human language, the kind of belief that not only does it make us special and distinctive and separate, but it also gives us the license to describe and account for and represent everything on the planet. So what these essays are trying to do, in a way that is quite fascinating for the reader, is trying to grapple, if you like, with the potential paradox of the linguistic narcissism of humans. So, in conclusion, I think that this volume could not be more timely, could not be more important. I think it gives us tools for thinking through our present age, the major problems of the present moment. I think secondly, what it does is it brings to the attention of the reader, I think this is extremely important, is the sheer range and vitality of contemporary Italian culture and writing. And I think thirdly and finally, it is an extremely important testimony to the enduring importance of modern language scholarship in the Anglophone world. Modern languages, which has been experiencing a crisis of recruitment and funding in the English-speaking world for more than 2 decades now. One of the things that is shown by this book is how crucial modern languages are and the perspectives that they bring to enriching and complexifying the regimes of attention in the Anglophone world, so that we are able to move away from the suffocating and dangerous tyranny of monolingual and monocultural perspectives on our planet. So, complimenti a tutti. Congratulations to everyone who's been involved in this project. And I think particular thanks are owed to Enrica Maria Ferrara for having brought this project to a successful conclusion. And I can only recommend once again, very strongly to everyone, to get your hands on one of the copies of this extremely instructive, vital and enriching book. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I don't know how, I would like to really clap, but it is very difficult to clap. So, well, I am humbled, I have to say, Michael, I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for this introduction. And I would like to say a few words of thanks, if I am allowed, before I start my own presentation, which is very interlinked and interconnected with the wonderful presentation that Michael has already done. So first of all, I would like to thank Renata Sperandia, with whom it is always a pleasure to collaborate. This must be my third or fourth book launch at the Institute, and I'm so thrilled, and I was so delighted when Renata invited me for this launch. And I'm grateful, of course, to so many friends and colleagues who are here tonight. It is really hard and I can't really mention them all, but I'm especially thankful to all the contributors without whom this volume would not exist, and for their enthusiastic and supportive and patience throughout the editing and the peer review of the book. And Stanislao Pugliese, I can see him in the audience, director of the brilliant Palgrave series, Italian and Italian American Studies. Thank you so much for having me in your collection. And my most heartfelt thanks go, of course, to the distinguished scholars who read the book ahead of publication and advised me and encouraged me and wrote the praise that you can see and you can read. Actually, this is the book that you can read in the front matter and in the back cover of the book, and they are Pierpaolo Antonello, Michael Cronin, Serenella Iovino, Roberto Marchesini, and Charlotte Ross. And last but not least, I would like to thank my family for their continued love and support, and particularly my husband, Paul, who helped me through a few stumbling blocks, emotional blocks, you know, like during the process of this book, and throughout the last year, which has been particularly tough. But yes, so to start, you know, like introducing and say a few words about the book, Michael Cronin has done a brilliant job summarizing the relevance of this book to current discourse. So I don't want to dwell on this any more than necessary, but I would like to mention a sentence that struck me particularly that I read in the Irish Times. The head of emergencies, Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO, is quoted to have said that humans have become parasites on a fragile planet, destabilizing an ecosystem that has sustained them through hundreds of years, thousands of years, in fact. Now, the notion of humans as parasites suggests, on the one hand, of course, our displacement in the ecosystem. We're certainly not the dominant subject of humanism any longer. The Vitruvian man has certainly been decentered. But on the other hand, not only we are marginal, but we're also vectors of disease and pollution. As parasites. So as vectors of disease, we are on a par with other species as far as the coronavirus is concerned, at least. A virus that you all know easily crosses the boundaries between human and non-human animals. Now, in fact, we're worse than other species because our polluting habits are actively destroying the ecosystem. Now, while in many ways we can endorse this metaphor from a post-anthropocentric perspective, it is easily seen how problematic the comparison of humans and parasites is. Think about the powerful anti-classist subtext in the award-winning South Korean movie Parasite by Bong Joon-ho. In the movie, those who live like parasites in flooded basements and dark dungeons are the lower classes who have been dehumanized. And in European culture, we don't have to go too far back in history to find examples of this zoomorphic metaphor in Primo Levi, for example, when he describes the horror of the concentration camps and the dehumanization of humans. And tomorrow is the day of memory, il giorno della memoria. In Nazi Germany, the Jews were often compared to parasites or vermin, and therefore that they could be eliminated without any concern. And yet, in describing the victims of the Holocaust as humans who have been stripped of their willpower, dignity, and rationality, Levi wonders if these dehumanized humans, compared to animals or parasites, are more human than their perpetrators. So the question is, and was, and is today as well, where does the human-animal divide lie? And what is it that makes the humans human? Now, this question has been asked already before or this book by another fantastic publication, like that is Thinking Italian Animals, edited by Amberson and Elena Past. But from a different perspective, of course. And this very question of the human-animal divide is asked by Elio Vittorini in his 1945 novel, Uomini e No, Men and Not Men, that constitute a central piece of my introduction. Now, the novel is set in Milan, occupied by the Germans during World War II. And in this novel, there is a heart-wrenching scene of a human prisoner, you probably remember this, eaten alive by a German dog who has been trained to ravage humans. Now, the scene would be enough for Vittorini to mull over the human-animal divide, but he goes one step further, and in a very experimental section of this novel, he depicts the dogs speaking to one another. Now, this is very surreal, the effect is very surreal, but ties in with what Vittorini intended to do. What he intended to suggest is, and I quote, that we men can also be not men. There are in each human many non-human possibilities, end of quote. So the dogs who respond to the most basic animal instinct as they're able to eat a human, but are also able to express themselves in human language like rational beings, are therefore part of this strategy of blurring the boundaries between human and animal. So that's the human-animal divide. And so touching on this, I have introduced something that Michael has already exposed as well in his introduction, the theme of the book as of the boundaries between the human and other non-human entities that are also technology and the environment. But it is also important to dwell on the other part of this equation, and it is the idea of identity, which leads us then to understand a bit more in depth what is posthumanist about the human. So nobody will argue that the traditional human has been decentered, and this repositioning does not only affect the animal other. In fact, in the second half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, we're looking at a human whose self is, and I will quote Enrico Vettori's chapter on Gianni Celati, coextensive with the world and the environment, end of quote. A human whose identity can be digitally shared, reproduced, linked with others in the World Wide Web, and reduced to images. And this is something that Giancarlo Alfano brilliantly describes in his chapter on digital poetry. It is a porous and relational identity immersed in the world of phenomena, with no essential qualities, and in constant, and I here borrow a term from Karen Barrett, interaction with the human and non-human other. And it is posthumanist, and identity is posthumanist, and I cite here Eugenio Bolongaro, not because it aims to eliminate humanism, but rather to recognize and remain sensitive to the failures of historical humanism, so patriarchy, Eurocentrism, colonialism, while at the same time recognizing the positive contribution of that tradition. End of quote. So the question is not only what is human and what is non-human in human identity, but when the repositioning of the human towards other species and non-human entities started, what has changed about human identity as a result of this shift in the humanistic tradition? And how has this all been captured in Italian literature and film? A big question indeed. So this is where I positioned myself. I started investigating the material for this book. And the contributors brilliantly, of course, helped and answered these questions. So in Italian literature, we find first cues of the posthuman human in the non-anthropocentric vision of Leopardi's Zibaldone. In this diary, as brilliantly illustrated by Gianna Conrad, we find a powerful vision linking the human to other species on the basis of a shared vulnerability of all creatures, what Michael mentioned as well in his introduction, this theme of shared vulnerability. It is a key common denominator between humans and other species, an important indicator of the continuum nature-culture. And this brings us back to that 20th century image or 21st century image of the humans as parasites, fragile and decentered, but also to some of the reflections on suffering that Eugenio Bolongaro explored in La Vita Oscena of Aldo Nove. In his chapter, he talks about how the protagonist's own grief at the loss of his mother intersects with that of other species and the environment, and opens the path to a new epistemology and new ethics. So the theme of grief and shared vulnerability is also crucial in the chapter by Todesco and Somma, which beautifully summarizes how the investigation regarding the boundaries between human and other species has been extended in the late 20th century to encompass the sense of effects and loss linking humans and machines. And this is exemplified through their analysis of the novel Bambini di Ferro by Viola di Grado through the theme of android maternity in a very original way. But how do we get from Leopardi to Viola di Grado and Aldo Nove? We have to step back quickly to the 19th century again. And remember that a couple of decades after Leopardi completed his diary, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin was published in 1859. So evolutionarism emphasized continuity between the human and other species and questioned the exceptionality of the human. And one of the first reactions by those who felt threatened by these theories, as Roberto Marchesini underlines, was to confine the humans exclusively to a cultural dimension and instead depict the animal as the radical other. So we have human on one side and the animals on the other. The polarization of culture and nature became more extreme in an attempt to salvage the exceptionality of the human. So the Cartesian human, after the blow of evolutionary theories, was kind of reborn, if you want to say, from its own ashes. And the human language as the tool to express the human essence became the main border between the identity of the human and that of other species, the environment and the technological other. So we are here now at the beginning of the 20th century. We have colonialism, imperialism, the fascist rhetoric around human exceptionalism, which then led to the dehumanization of the humans. They were all nourished by this anthropocentric belief in the human animal, or this polarization of the anthropocentric belief in the human animal and nature culture divide. Now, there were exceptions, of course, and reactions during modernism, for example, in Pirandello's work, as competently highlighted by Godioli, Jansen, and Vandenberg in their chapter. And modernism was, in a sense, the incubator of posthumanist aspirations and beliefs. And I believe that Godioli and Vandenberg have a book on this topic in the pipeline. But to reach the so-called posthumanist turn, in which philosophers, writers, and directors came to terms with the fact that human identity was being irreversibly changed by a relationship with the animal other, the environment, and technology, all demanding agency, we have to wait until the 60s with Calvino and Pasolini, in my opinion. And again, it is interesting to see how much of the speculation for those who attempted to portray this repositioning of the human towards the non-human revolves around language. So one of the questions seems to be, how do we really voice the language of the other if all we have, as Michael was saying, is a kind of narcissism, if all we have is the human language, which then becomes a tool to dominate the vulnerable other? So Calvino responded, as Serenella Jovino reminds us, giving voice to hybrid forms of nature culture, such as the arboreal man Cosimo di Rondeau, the human technological assemblage of the non-existent night, and then in the 1960s, the quintessential hybrid human-non-human character, the palindrome Kufk, who is several things, a unicellular organism, a dinosaur, a mammal, as an example of contiguity with other nature and agents, as Jovino would say. And hybridization is a tool we also find magnificently deployed in the narrative of Laura Pugno, for example, in the hybrid fox-human of La Caccia, in the feral child of La Ragazza Selvaggia, or in the mezza umana, the fish-human in Mermaids, in Sirene. And as Marco Amici points out in his chapter, this hybrid characters are mute, and the attempt to teach the mermaid how to speak, and I quote, is a form of colonization of the animal mind, end of quote, and reflects Pugno's critique of the anthropocentric extractivist mindset embodied by the idea of language as an expression of human exceptionalism. So in some, human language is a flexible tool to narrate identity, to express the polysemic diversity of our beautiful ecosystem, but also is a barrier to overcome in order to find real ways to communicate with the environmental and animal other. Now, many of you will remember Pasolini's film, The Hawks and the Sparrow, Uccellacci Uccellini, which already in 1966 emphasized how important it is to crack the code of other species, languages, and communication to communicate with the other. You might remember the two friars, Brother Cicillo and Brother Ninetto, Totò and Ninetto Davoli, sent on a mission to preach love to the birds. And you will remember their joy when they finally managed to learn the language of the sparrows who hop rather than whistle. Now we should have a clip, like a very, very short clip now to show. Thank you, Deborah.
Comunicavano saltellando. Come dunque si parlavano fra loro i passeri? Che linguaggio avevi imparato, frate Cicillo, nelle sue lunghe meditazioni? È semplice, i passeri comunicavano saltellando.
Thank you very much. That actually worked. You never know in these situations. But you see the beautiful dance and the plasticity of Totò, beautiful expressive choice of acting by Pasolini. Now, the happiness of Totò and Ninetto is short-lived as they discover that even if they have learned how to communicate with the hawks and the sparrows individually, the two species do not know how to communicate to one another. So the hawk will kill and eat the sparrow despite all the efforts. Now, the visionary Pasolini would have certainly endorsed Michael Cronin's principle of tradosphere. And I quote from Eco Translation, which I should have here, but I don't have it handy. The sum of all translation systems on the planet, all the ways in which information circulates between living and non-living organisms and is translated into a language or a code that can be processed or understood by the receiving entity, end of quote. So this is the concept of tradosphere. Now, there are so many different languages in the ecosystem, and this applies not only to the animal kingdom. If we look at the human realm, visual arts, animation and comics, performance and gesture, computer code might be more relatable, more appealing for some humans than spoken or written language. And Pasolini himself made very clear that as reality was cinema in nature, he deemed image signs more apt to channel reality to all humans. So it has in fact been underlined by posthumanist scholars that hybrid genres and media forms, audiovisual techniques, digital art are better equipped than written text to capture representations of posthuman identity. And this is wonderfully demonstrated by Fabio Camilletti in his chapter, which explores the figure of the zombie, as we've seen, as an emblem of social unrest in the 1980s. And it does that through several types of text, which move between different media, literature, music, theater, and comics, etc. And indeed, Paolo Saporito, in his original chapter on Michelangelo Antonioni's cinema, demonstrates how the camera can be seen as an apparatus that shows the entanglement of the human and the non-human, but also can be seen as an epistemological agent enacting boundaries between, and I quote, what matters and what is excluded from mattering. So technology has a privileged place in this book both because it is the expressive tool humans use to facilitate expression of posthuman identity, as I said, in digital art, computer language, and cinema, but also as an agent that via interaction with the human has modified the way we communicate with one another. So think about the way many humans have now become just a presence on screen, like today, a flickering signifier written in code, a digital presence. Now, some of us will see this fate worse than death, but some, even before coronavirus, embrace this digital reality as the only possible form of identity. And I'm thinking of Elena Ferrante and my own chapter on Elena Ferrante. But where did this all start? And I'm going to conclude soon. Where the start was Cristina Varade, who is here. She's from the United States, but she's here in Dublin, and this is like one of the gifts of the coronavirus at the UCD fellow at the UCD Humanities Institute. So Cristina Varade takes a long look at what now is the prehistory of relationship between the human and cellular telephony in Colicchia, Nova, and De Carlo, and drawing on Harvey's notion of the cyborg, illustrates how liberating and simultaneously alienating the new fragmented subject of the interconnected human telephony identity is. Brilliant chapter. And Eleonora Lima, in her chapter on Luciano Bianciardi and Tiziano Scarpa, persuasively describes how technology of the telephone and the washing machine, respectively, became in the 1960s one of the sites in which gender identity was negotiated and traditional femininity was either suppressed, like happened in Bianciardi's case, or enhanced and emancipated, like happens in Madrigale by Tiziano Scarpa. In this short story, the washing machine becomes responsible not only for the protagonist's conception, but also for his ability to communicate and overcome his initial stutter. As I quote from Lima's chapter, the rhythmic bumps of the spin cycle allow him to articulate words otherwise impossible to utter. Now, I will not go into further detail of Lima's essay, which uses Kristeva's objection theory and, again, the figure of the cyborg, but I would like to highlight how the human-machine nexus, which is essentially an ancestor of the human-technology interconnectedness that is now ubiquitous, is seen in Scarpa's story as molding and hybridizing the speech of the protagonist. So language becomes no longer a tool to express human exceptionalism, but the embodiment of a new posthuman human. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both you and Michael. It's been wonderful to listen to both of you. And just I was reminded, in case I really needed, that literature and art really makes us rediscover space-time identity. And in this case, I mean, even this shift in borders we are experiencing is part of our new world. And I have good news for everyone. Tiziano Scarpa is with us. I haven't seen him, but I think I'll have to switch to Italian if you don't mind. Quindi buonasera, sappiamo che è arrivato tra noi Tiziano Scarpa, che non vedo, ma che mi hanno detto è riuscito, nonostante i suoi moltissimi impegni, a trovare il tempo di venirci a trovare. E non so se può manifestarsi.
Sono qui. I'm connected. Thank you very much for this invitation. Vi ringrazio. Insomma, se ho capito bene, preferite in questo momento parlare italiano, ma insomma decidetelo voi, ecco, come preferite.
A questo punto era stato promesso al nostro pubblico che la seconda parte sarebbe stata in italiano.
E quindi le promesse vanno mantenute.
Di sì. Quindi grazie ancora di aver trovato il tempo, so che sono state giornate davvero
impegnative. Ma era no, ma scherziamo, io mi sarei connesso a partire dall'inizio. Il martedì sera dalle 19 alle 21 ora italiana ho un impegno di lavoro in connessione, quindi alle 21 in punto mi sono sconnesso e sono passato qui da voi. Comunque bando a queste cose che non interessano molto. Io sono qui per voi e quindi vi ascolto intanto, e poi se volete, quando volete, sono qua a rispondere.
Enrica vuol prendere la parola. Io ho presentato proprio rapidissimamente Tiziano Scarpa. Insomma, lo ringraziamo per i libri che ha scritto, per il lavoro che sta facendo anche proprio sulla voce e sulla rappresentazione della voce. I libri che conosciamo tutti sono Stabat Mater e ovviamente quello che è stato più forse fortunato fin dall'inizio, da tanto tempo, è Venezia è un pesce, che ha una nuova edizione poi recentissima. Tiziano Scarpa lavora moltissimo sulla parola, sulla voce, e quindi questo è uno degli aspetti forse più interessanti. Per chi è curioso, c'è una sua lettura dell'infinito particolarmente interessante che forse si trova online. E io lascerei la parola davvero a Enrica e forse alla persona che si è occupata di Tiziano Scarpa all'interno del libro, che è la dottoressa Lima, e lascio a voi interloquire con Tiziano Scarpa.
Ecco, grazie mille Renata, grazie mille a Tiziano Scarpa per appunto per essere venuto, per averci e per deliziarci con la sua presenza. Io sono una grande appassionata appunto dei suoi romanzi, della sua scrittura. In realtà credo che ci fosse stato promesso una lettura di testi e appunto non vedo l'ora che ci sia questa lettura. Chiaramente mi piacerebbe anche sapere, insomma, e questo avendo letto l'ultimo libro, bellissimo libro, La penultima magia, che veramente trovo affascinante perché si intreccia con tematiche ecologiche, ambientaliste anche, insomma, ma soprattutto quello che io trovo che crea quello che dicevo io, un nuovo linguaggio, no? Il linguaggio del postumanesimo, che io chiamo del postumanesimo, ma insomma, che è un linguaggio fiabesco, in un certo senso appunto sperimenta, va in una direzione nuova per sperimentare il modo in cui esprimere queste tematiche che non sono appunto di facile espressione perché ci troviamo di fronte appunto ad un nuovo individuo postumano. Quindi abbiamo nella penultima magia questi bellissimi esempi, no? I lampioni di strada che camminano, la caffettiera che parla, che comunica appunto con la nonna, e quello che mi ha molto interessato è che la nonna Renata, che è la protagonista della penultima magia, Renata appunto, no? Che ha poi anche un bellissimo gatto come Renata Sperandio, sì, ha anche un gatto, inizialmente appunto all'inizio del romanzo noi vediamo che appunto ha un rapporto con gli oggetti, che comunica con gli oggetti, ma che poi alla fine si capisce all'inizio che questa sua dimensione è una dimensione di follia, no? Ma è veramente una dimensione di follia? O è, ecco, questo è quello che mi interessava chiedere, in realtà un testo invece che secondo me parla moltissimo della comunicazione appunto tra l'umano e il non umano, che non è necessariamente una dimensione appunto di follia, ma una dimensione che può essere ed è una dimensione reale.
Sì, c'è stato un momento, un segmento minuscolo in cui si è fermata la sua immagine e ho perso, prima che lei dicesse questo mi interessa chiedere e forse la frase precedente lei formulava la domanda, ho capito male.
No, dicevo appunto, mi interessava sapere appunto se questa dimensione della comunicazione tra l'umano e il non umano, no, è effettivamente una dimensione di follia o è una dimensione che noi cerchiamo di riprodurre con la fiaba o con l'idea del diverso, del malato, ma che in realtà è reale, ecco.
Beh, sono tante domande nascoste ci sono dentro questa domanda. Intanto, lasciatemi dire una cosa, non è una premessa lunga, spero, però intanto ho letto il saggio di Eleonora Lima e sono molto contento cioè, vi dico una cosa, io non leggo quasi mai, insomma, leggo con molta difficoltà i contributi di studiosi e studiose che hanno la generosità di perdere tempo, dedicare la loro intelligenza sulle mie cose. Provo un certo imbarazzo a essere preso sul serio, non che io, insomma, ecco, non so, mi sembra perché io ho un'idea della letteratura, come posso dire, io mi fido delle immagini, mi fido delle figure. Io penso che, me lo sono chiesto tanto vedendo quello che fanno gli altri, le altre, scrittori, scrittrici, autori, autrici. Molti fanno romanzi storici, molti raccontano fatti di cronaca, e io più vado avanti, più penso che almeno una parte importante della letteratura sia scommettere sul infondato, su quello che è infondato. non necessariamente parlare di personaggi storici, o se lo si fa sono pretesti per inventare. Inventare, per me la letteratura è inventare, ma inventare, per chi inventa sa che è infondato. Io mi fido delle figure. Cosa vuol dire figure? Vuol dire personaggi, visioni, trame, situazioni, paesaggi, colpi di scena, suspense, la figuralità, le figure che appartengono al racconto, alla narrazione. Quindi io faccio parte di questa tribù. L'altra tribù è la tribù dei temi, come posso dire, degli argomenti. Ecco, anch'io una parte della mia mente, della mia anima è razionale e ragiona per temi, per argomenti, ma io quando mi metto a scrivere un romanzo, un racconto, io mi fido delle visioni, delle figure, spingo il mio pensiero figurale, non il mio pensiero concettuale, tematico, che poi mi serve magari per autointerpretarmi dopo. E quindi, in questo caso, trovo veramente meraviglioso che chi invece, come la studiosa qui presente e voi in generale, ma insomma Eleonora Lima, applica un pensiero concettuale, tematico, interpretativo, ermeneutico al mio pensiero figurale. E ho trovato splendido, anche fin troppo, cioè, ha preso molto sul serio il mio pensiero figurale, ecco, no? Della lavatrice, ecco, no? E l'ha interpretato in una maniera come con tutti i suoi strumenti culturali, prendendo sul serio il mio pensiero figurale, che in quanto tale, capitemi, io so che è infondato, non nel senso che scrivo a casaccio, ecco, non vuol dire che scrivo a caso, io butto, no, io mi fido delle visioni e cerco di dare consistenza. Ecco, no? Consistenza artistica, plausibilità, a volte verosimiglianza, più o meno. Ecco. Quindi, tornando alla domanda, ecco, scusate questa premessa, ma andava fatta, era anche un modo per ringraziare Eleonora Lima e il suo, che non conosco, non ho avuto il piacere di incontrare, per la prima volta vedo così in una piccola casella, e quindi la ringrazio di cuore per l'intelligenza concettuale, tematica, interpretativa, ermeneutica che ha applicato e con cui ha dato valore alle mie figure, alle mie così visioni, intuizioni figurali. Ecco. Bene, detto questo, anche lì io mi fido dell'intuizione figurale, dico, appunto, questa signora ha avuto un grande lutto, la penultima magia, insopportabile. Come si reagisce al caos, no? Come fa, come ci ha insegnato l'arte, che come si fa a non precipitare nella pazzia, nella disperazione, nel caos, proprio quello dove le furie, le rinni urlano e non c'è più proprio, non c'è redenzione, non c'è possibilità di... Beh, l'arte ci ha insegnato che, per esempio, si dà forma al caos, no? Si cerca l'elegia, no? The elegy in front of a tomb, no? Cioè, si piange, ma si piange con dei ritmi, delle rime, della metrica, con una melodia. Si cerca di sagomare, no? La pazzia, chiamiamola, l'illusione, lei crede di essere una fata, crede di parlare con la caffettiera, con i lampioni, per sopportare il mondo, ecco, perché ha perso sua figlia. Ecco. Però la sua interpretazione, infatti, ho detto, mentre lei mi faceva la domanda, io ho detto, accidenti, ha ragione, però ha ragione, alla fine parla con le cose, è vero, sebbene in questa situazione un pochino psicotica, un pochino una fantasia, è solo l'inizio del libro, per chi non l'ha letto, sono le prime 30-40 pagine, questa signora anziana crede di essere una fata, dove tutto è incantato, dove gli oggetti le preparano la colazione, insomma, come succede nelle favole, insomma, no? L'abbiamo visto 1000 volte, Alice al Paese delle Meraviglie, eccetera. no? Però effettivamente è vero, c'è un dialogo fra l'organico e l'inorganico, avrebbe detto Perniola, no? C'è, è chiaro, no? È vero, sì. Quindi io posso rispondere, però non da tematizzatore, non da concettualizzatore, da uno che si è fidato di questa visione e le ha dato fiducia e le ha dato forma e l'ha scritta. E quindi sì, nella mia banale interpretazione, così nelle mie intenzioni, era certo, c'è una signora anziana che ha avuto un grandissimo lutto e per sopportare questo lutto pensa di essere una fata in una città deserta, non ci sono più gli esseri umani, perché gli esseri umani muoiono, ti abbandonano, ti deludono, ti danno dei grandi lutti. E lei è la fata di questa città deserta dove parla con le cose la vezzeggiano, le vogliono bene, ecco. E quindi questo è un po' ed ecco un po' così, insomma, la mia impostazione in quel romanzo è stata così, poi c'è il grande momento del disincantesimo, il grande momento in cui lei disincanta tutto e disincanta anche la bacchetta magica. Ecco, io volevo anche raccontare questo, godermi in maniera figurale questa situazione. C'è anche un godimento narrativo nel dire, bene, non c'è solo il tema, bene, raccontiamola questa colazione, raccontiamo questa passeggiata nella città, raccontiamo il bombardamento che fa distruggere la città incantata, raccontiamo la discesa nel pozzo per disincantare. Come si fa a disincantare una bacchetta magica? Facile disincantare, togliere l'incantesimo, ma come fa l'oggetto incantatore a disincantare se stesso? Cioè, queste sono poi, io credo, le pulsioni, gli slanci artistici che spingono un narratore, una narratrice a buttarsi nella visione, che sia più o meno consapevole, diciamo, dei contenuti tematici, concettuali dei suoi racconti. Chiaro, sono una persona razionale anch'io, 2 o 3 strumenti e mezzo per sapere più o meno cosa potrebbe significare quello che racconto, forse li ho, ecco, però appunto anche per non essere sempre così razionale, io ringrazio la letteratura perché è un'istituzione tutto sommato seria, vedete siete qua studiosi eccetera, che mi permette di fare un po' il pazzo, cioè di raccontare cose assurde, no? E vengo pure preso sul serio. L'istituzione umana della civiltà chiama letteratura anche questa cosa qui, dove ha riservato, grazie al cielo, anche a una parte dell'anima la possibilità di esprimersi attraverso visioni, figure e non necessariamente attraverso temi, concetti, argomenti che sono fondamentalissimi e ai quali non rinuncerei mai, sia chiaro, ecco.
No, io ringrazio moltissimo perché in realtà già sento che c'è la possibilità di creare un nuovo studio tematico appunto sulla interazione tra umani e oggetti, ma in realtà questa è una cosa in relazione al tema della malattia, cosa che mi era già capitato leggendo appunto dei testi molto belli di Laura Pugno, ad esempio, o testi di Simona Baldelli, ma leggendo questo testo fiabesco mi aveva appunto dato uno stimolo, ho avuto uno stimolo immediatamente a pensare alla possibilità di una tematica ecologica, ma non soltanto ecologica, proprio in senso postumanista, no? Di relazione tra l'umano e il non umano. Lo so che c'è l'animismo delle fiabe, lo so insomma che c'è anche, però credo che sia molto pertinente a quelle che sono delle tematiche che ho osservato, diciamo, nella letteratura italiana, ma anche internazionale in questi ultimi anni. E vorrei innanzitutto dare la parola a Eleonora Lima, se vuole, diciamo, presentarsi, no? Se vuole dire qualcosa, è assolutamente non programmato, quindi insomma se Eleonora vuole parlare o non vuole parlare, però le vorrei dare la possibilità appunto di presentarsi, se vuole.
Sì, grazie mille Enrica e ringrazio moltissimo Tiziano Scarpa delle parole e dell'attenzione per aver letto il mio articolo, insomma mai avrei pensato. Sì, una cosa che effettivamente mi rendo conto che proprio con una scrittura come quella di Tiziano Scarpa, ma anche come quella di Bianciardi, c'è talmente una forza espressiva e un'esplosione di immagini che riportarle ogni volta nel campo dell'analisi, della critica letteraria è come un mettere in sordina quello che poi sulla pagina invece trova la sua dimensione. Sì, devo dire che proprio appunto il mio articolo mette un po' a confronto il racconto madrigale di Scarpa e parti di Bianciardi alla vita agra. Quello che mi interessava in entrambi era proprio questo allontanarsi dal realismo e questo godimento nell'esplorare immagini e nella ricchezza della parola, che vedevo come una possibilità postumana, appunto, questa identità che sta nella parola e nell'espressione. Sono molto contenta e ringrazio Enrica, ringrazio Scarpa.
Sei stata bravissima, l'ho detto in inglese, lo ripeto ancora, questa è stata una bellissima, uno dei bellissimi saggi, sono tutti bellissimi chiaramente, insomma, però il saggio di Eleonora appunto esplora in particolare il discorso, no, della formazione di un nuovo linguaggio e si incrocia anche con la tematica di genere, insomma, e questo era un aspetto molto molto importante, insomma, come viene evidenziato attraverso il linguaggio, l'ibridazione, insomma, anche, no, del personaggio, dell'umano con la tecnologia, no? Come viene ad emergere, insomma, la femminilità, il genere, insomma, il discorso di genere dal testo, e so che non c'era magari intenzionalità, non c'era fino in fondo, però questa lettura, forse i lettori, no, ci hanno visto qualcosa, no? Eleonora decisamente ha fatto un lavoro, un ottimo lavoro appunto nell'esplorare questo testo. A proposito di testi, c'è per caso la possibilità di ascoltare qualcosa dalla sua voce? Tiziano Scarpa, non
No,
so.
ma certo, ma scherziamo, era una promessa, vi tocca, mi dispiace, insomma, ecco che stavo pensando che io non ci avevo pensato prima, ma io mi sento un po' più a mio agio. Ecco, facciamo così. Perché questo assomiglia un po' di più alla mia situazione reale che mi piace vivere. La verità è questa, vi dico la verità. Io ho capito abbastanza presto, ahimè, 25 anni fa, alle prime presentazioni di libri, la pochezza, la malinconia di una situazione in cui in libreria qualcuno si siede vicino a te e deve per forza dire: ah, ma questo signore ha scritto un bel libro, compratelo, è bello, no? Cioè, è tristissimo, no? È una rappresentazione drammaturgica penosa, perché proprio è polverosa. Allora, da quel momento ho cominciato un po' anche perché mi piaceva farlo per conto mio, leggere a voce alta a casa, e ho cominciato a fare delle letture sceniche. E quindi questa che vedete è una situazione per me molto consueta, ne ho fatte credo 1 migliaio nella vita, ma sul serio, in 25 anni, nelle biblioteche, nei teatri, nelle piazze. Voi però mi chiedete una cosa veramente imbarazzante, perché questo racconto, e leggo l'inizio di Madrigale, io l'ho scritto nel 91, cioè a 30 anni questa roba qua, capite? Poi è stato pubblicato nel 98 e io cerco di stare lontanissimo dalla lettura e dalla riapertura dei miei vecchi libri, perché ecco, no? Però vabbè, per voi vi leggo qualche pagina e vi dico, preferisco, anziché spiegare il significato delle mie fantasie, preferisco leggerle, no, non dico stasera che sono disposto a spiegare quello che riesco a spiegare, ma in generale nella vita, invece di fare presentazioni e spiegazioni, puoi aprire. e preferisco leggere, quindi vi leggo qualche pagina. Madrigale, che ha una scansione con le lettere dell'alfabeto. Ogni paragrafo ha una lettera dell'alfabeto. Ecco. Madrigale. Prima che l'operazione alla gola gli togliesse la parola di bocca, Attilio l'ha sempre detto che sono figlio di un aumento di stipendio. Taci tu che sei figlio di un aumento di stipendio. Io sono figlio di una lavatrice Rex nuova fiammante, trascinata su per le scale da 2 facchini a forza di bestemmie. B. Ottobre 1962 d.C. La lavatrice Rex a caricamento dall'alto e cestello in acciaio inox lavora a tutta forza in preda al boom economico. Sciacqua per la prima volta i panni sporchi di famiglia. Tutta questa furia centrifuga è direttamente connessa all'euforia produttiva della nazione tramite presa elettrica nella parete. Un terremoto elettrodomestico si è impossessato del bagno, il pavimento è scosso da un pavimoto inaudito. C. Nell'ottobre del 1962 d.C. Attilio piazza la lavatrice nuova di zecca accanto alla vasca da bagno. Niente a che vedere con le lavatrici dall'oblò di plexiglass. Non confondiamo le acque, per favore. Non confondiamo le mie acque amniotiche con il detersivo per capi delicati a 37 gradi. Non potrei mai essere stato figlio di una normale lavatrice con un oblò di plexiglass. Quelle con lo sportello tondo a oblò erano lavatrici felpate, ultra silenziose, sfizi da ricchi, tutta scena da sbattere sul muso alle cognate nell'ora del tè. La lavatrice Rex a caricamento dall'alto, no. Scatolotto cieco, design senza pretese, 4 spigoli su carta millimetrata tirati via col righello da un geometra stipendiato dalla premiata fabbrica Rex & Company. Di ottobre 1962. Attilio ha sfogliato avanti e indietro il libretto di istruzioni, si è stufato, ha schiacciato i tasti della pulsantiera a casaccio finché la lavatrice si è messa in moto. La paragono di proposito a quegli altari pagani disegnati nei rebus della settimana enigmistica, perché sopra la lavatrice Rex Attilio ci ha sistemato mia... Dillo con parole tue. Attilio ci ha sistemato sopra mia madre, nuda come mia nonna l'ha fatta. Attilio si è intromesso dentro di lei, mentre mia madre montava la centrifuga della lavatrice Rex come si monta un toro meccanico da rodeo. E dentro la lavatrice una camicetta, una gonna, un paio di mutande e un reggiseno. Sopra la lavatrice tutto il resto di mia madre. Direi che può bastare così, ecco, no? Ma è veramente un'esperienza pazzesca questa che mi avete fatto fare, cioè mi avete fatto riaprire l'inizio di un racconto che io non, ecco, con cui non avevo a che fare dal 1998, veramente. Nel 91.
Dublino ed Enrica Maria Ferrara per compiere questo. Speriamo che sia un miracolo e non una brutta cosa, ma io credo che abbiamo gradito davvero tutti quanti.
Tantissimo, sì, assolutamente, è stato bellissimo.
Grazie davvero.
Io sono molto legato a questo racconto, se posso aggiungere una cosa però, perché è uno dei miei racconti più dove si intreccia fortissimamente la storia al linguaggio e la frase iniziale è stata nella mia mente una specie di mantra per settimane, mesi, quasi come quasi come, insomma, adesso scusate se cito delle cose un po' nell'idea di Valéry, della poesia, era come un primo verso, e questa frase, io me lo ricordo, che ha anche delle caratteristiche metriche nascoste, insomma, pur essendo prosa. Prima che l'operazione alla gola gli togliesse la parola di bocca, Attilio l'ha sempre detto che sono figlio di un aumento di stipendio. Taci tu che sei figlio di un aumento di stipendio. E questo prima che l'operazione alla gola gli togliesse la parola di bocca, Attilio l'ha sempre detto che sono figlio di un aumento di stipendio. Questa frase, prima che l'operazione alla... che poi è anche perfida, no? Come dire, cioè me l'hai detto che sono non più che figlio tuo, io sono nato perché ti hanno aumentato lo stipendio, ecco, l'hai pagata, perché prima che l'operazione alla gola ti togliesse la parola di bocca, no? Quasi, sapete, la logica della pensée sauvage o post hoc ergo propter hoc, no? Mi hai detto questo e poi come una nemesi l'hai pagata, che non hai potuto più parlare perché non hai potuto più avere la voce. Questo dice il mio perfido narratore. E questa frase, io mi ricordo all'epoca, avevo 28 anni, è stato uno dei primi racconti che ho scritto abbastanza, insomma, degni forse di non essere buttati nel cestino, ecco, è scaturita da questa frase perfida, da questo incipit martellante, per me ricorrente. Ecco, così ve lo dico per quel che vale.
Interessante questa cosa. Volevo anche aggiungere, tra l'altro, che Eleonora ho fatto quasi una mezza traduzione del racconto in inglese, insomma, lo volevo dire così, non so se la completerà, magari la completerà, io le ho offerto il mio aiuto e quindi magari poi un giorno potrà anche vedere la luce in inglese, perché se non sbaglio non c'è in inglese, è vero? Non esiste ancora.
No, non c'è, che io sappia, cioè no, lo saprei, ma insomma
Sì.
poi magari...
Sì, ok.
Ma non mi pare, pubblicato no di sicuro, poi non credo che...
Sarà molto, molto difficile tradurre appunto la bellezza e anche il ritmo di questi versi e infatti forse Eleonora ci vuole dire, è stato difficile tradurre quei pezzi che hai tradotto?
Beh, sì, soprattutto perché appunto il significato e la veste linguistica sono strettamente legati, quindi avendo l'italiano solamente in nota dovevo cercare di fare il meglio possibile per mantenere questo legame, perché non era solamente appunto il contenuto, altrimenti si sarebbe perso tutto, però sono a circa una metà, vedremo se riesco a portarlo in fondo.
Non so se qualcun altro ha altre domande oppure...
Beh, mi pare che abbiamo creato le condizioni per un appuntamento di Tiziano Scarpa a Dublino, invitatelo. Io vengo anch'io.
Meraviglioso, insomma, magari sarebbe bellissimo.
No, il fatto è che io tra poco me ne vado, quindi lascio in eredità anche questo impegno a chi mi sostituirà. Va bene se prendiamo le due domande che ti sono state rivolte, Enrica, e che forse hai visto nella chat?
Sto guardando adesso sinceramente perché mi ero così concentrata invece a sentire la lettura di Madrigale, speravo tanto, no, che potessimo continuare con quello, invece sì, vedo le domande, vedo una domanda, non so se poi sono ancora qui, Stefano Rossa e forse Stefano non c'è, non lo vedo, ma sicuramente c'è Stiliana Milkova. Sì, e vedo che Stiliana mi ha fatto una bella domanda. Rispondo in inglese? Un attimo solo che non la riesco a vedere bene, però. Pop out, scusatemi. Ecco. So, Stiliana says, I have a question for Enrica. You mentioned very briefly Elena Ferrante. Why is posthumanism important in her works? And can she be said to put forward a kind of post-humanist feminism? This is a brilliant question, very, very good question. And I think I should really try and answer the question in English rather than in Italian. Now, yes, it's very important in working from a female perspective. And Elena Ferrante put forward a kind of posthumanist idea. She's very much against a representationalist idea of the world. So like she doesn't believe in the world of object, in the world that is external to the human, awaiting a representation. She doesn't believe in the idea of a dominant man subject, knowing an object as a woman object, you know, like she doesn't believe in this. She believes in an intermingled and meshed in the world as an entanglement of human and non-human. This is what I have more or less demonstrated through and I hope, you know, like this is a reading that I know that some few scholars, or very, very few scholars, many scholars of Elena Ferrante actually have endorsed. If you think about, for example, the smarginatura, this was the loss of margin of the protagonist in the Neapolitan novels, and the fact that she sees the world as this mess and a kind of mesh of human flesh and environment and bits of nature, and everything is kind of like crossing the margin, and the environment is crossing the margin with the human, and the text is crossing the margin with the discourse is crossing the margin with nature. So it's considered, you know, in a sense, an illness. And this is why I was very interested in the idea of Tiziano Scarpa's La Penultima Magia, the idea that this illness might not be an illness after all. You know, this must be, in fact, the way women in Elena Ferrante's work see the world. And they see the world in a sense that, as I said, there is no hierarchy anymore in an anti-patriarchal way. You know, there is no subject, dominant subject or human and man position towards a woman object. And there is a loss of hierarchy in general, you know, like the complete loss of hierarchy. I don't know if I have answered, you know, the question. Stiliana is there, and I would like actually to say, you know, I think maybe this is the right time to announce that Stiliana will come to the Institute. So we'll have the book launch of Stiliana Milkova's on Elena Ferrante on the 23rd of February, and Anne Goldstein is going to be with us as well. Stiliana, have I answered your question? I don't know if she's still...
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much. Yes, very much so. So it's a kind of subversive position too. That loss of hierarchy is very much a subversive position as well.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. This is what I was trying to convey. Yes, and you have it in a very clear image of that in the Days of Abandonment, especially, you know, when Olga, the protagonist for the Days of Abandonment, loses her ability to actually live in the world. She completely loses her sense of logic and the space-time after the trauma of the abandonment by her husband. And then she actually looks at herself in the mirror and she doesn't recognize herself. And she realizes that the way she sees things and she sees her image is completely different, because like she cannot rely anymore on the gaze of her husband. And this is where I think the anti-patriarchal position, you know, of Elena Ferrante linked to posthumanism comes forth very, very strongly. But I'm sure we can talk about this again, you know, maybe on the 23rd or another. But thank you for the question. And I have Stefano Jossa's question here, but I think Stefano Jossa is not here.
I suspect it might be time to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Because I have, yes, I'm afraid normally these Zoom meetings tend to, you know, be shorter than this, but we were so lucky to have so many voices and and it was really worth being with you all. And I hope this is, I mean, for some of you who have not joined the events of the Institute, it might be a way to keep an eye on our newsletter and our webpage and come back to these virtual encounters. I'd like to thank Tiziano Scarpa. It's been a privilege, really. Thank you so much.
Grazie.
Michael Cronin, we'll meet again. Trinity, you're here, or hopefully alive in Rio. And thank you, Enrica, your family. So thank you so much. And thank you to Deborah, who's been the background and the technical support for all this. Hope to see you soon again, and all the best to the book. And
thank you very much.
Buona serata e grazie davvero a tutti. Vediamoci di nuovo, anche se è solo sul tablet per il momento. Thank you.
Arrivederci a tutti.
Grazie.
Grazie.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Grazie.